take a slow breath, and let the day fall away. Tonight, we drift into the cold, quiet mystery of the Alcatraz escape, a journey through fog, tide, and silence. No legends, no loud moments, just the steady tension of three men slipping into the night. Settle in, close your eyes, and let the calm weight of the story carry you towards sleep. The night inside Alcatraz was never truly silent. It breathed slow and metallic, like the whole prison was a single living creature made of rusted pipes and concrete lungs. The wind outside dragged across the windows in long, shivering strokes, but inside, the sounds were smaller, sharper. A distant footstep on the upper tier, a guard clearing his throat, the faint rattle of someone turning in their bunk 3 cells down. Frank Morris lay awake on his narrow mattress, his eyes half open, staring at the dark line where the ceiling met the wall. He wasn't resting. He hadn't truly rested in months. He was timing, counting, listening. The guard on duty walked with an uneven rhythm. 5 slow steps, a shift in weight, then another 5. The flashlight beam passed the bars exactly every 7 minutes on the dot. Frank had memorized the pattern the way other men memorized prayers. The cell was cold. The storm outside pushed its breath through the old concrete, seeping into the walls, making the rust on the bars sweat. Frank pulled his thin blanket tighter around his shoulders. His heartbeat stayed steady. He'd trained it to. Panic was noise. Noise was death. From the corridor to his left came a faint scrape. John Anglin shifting on his bunk. A coded signal. 2 soft taps against the pipe answered from Clarence on the other side. The 3 men had learned to speak through walls, without speaking at all. In this place, silence wasn't an absence. It was a language. Frank slid his hand under his pillow and felt for the small tools he'd hidden there. Metal pieces stolen from the workshop. A broken vacuum handle whittled down, sanded smooth, sharpened. Crude, ugly things. But they were enough. Enough to carve through the crumbling concrete behind his ventilation grill. Enough to make a hole just wide enough for a man to slip through. The grate in the wall stared at him, a square of darkness cut into darker stone. Behind it lay the utility passage, the forgotten artery of the prison, a cramped corridor of dust, pipes, and shadows. It smelled like old earth, old water, and old secrets. The first night Frank squeezed through it, he felt the island breathing differently, like he had found the rib cage beneath its skin. Tonight, the air felt heavier, thicker, different. Another footstep echoed above, closer this time. Frank kept his breathing shallow. The flashlight beam swept past his cell bars, a white line cutting the darkness for a split second. The papier-mâché head in his bed stayed still, its painted hair blending into the pillow. The guard didn't slow, didn't question. The beam moved on. Frank exhaled through his nose, barely a sigh. He turned slowly, reached toward the vent, and wrapped his fingers around its edge. The concrete flaked beneath his touch. Weeks of scraping grinding and dust-choked nights had weakened it enough. A gentle tug, and the grate shifted just slightly. Timing mattered. Every movement had to flow between the guard's rhythm. Even breathing had to weave between the hallway echoes. Frank counted silently. 1 minute, 2, 3. Then he pushed again. The grate loosened another inch. The storm outside pressed harder against the walls. Wind moaned somewhere deep in the pipes. A low, eerie sound that made the prison feel hollow inside. The ocean murmured beneath the island, a cold, patient whisper that seemed to say the same thing over and over. If you fail, I will take you. Frank leaned in close to the hole, his breath stirring the dust at its edge. The darkness inside the passage felt warm compared to the cell. Closer, more inviting in a strange, unsettling way. It was the closest thing to freedom he'd touched in years, even though it was just a cramped void between walls. Behind him, the mattress dipped slightly from the weight of the fake head. He reached out and adjusted it by instinct. It looked real enough. A sleeping man. A prisoner who never moved. Another scrape of metal. Another tap in the pipe. John checking in. Frank tapped back once. Steady. Ready. He reached into the hole and felt the rough ledge of concrete where the wall had been carved away. His fingers brushed against cold pipes, the entire structure humming faintly with the vibration of the prison. It felt like touching the spine of something huge. The guard's footsteps returned, slow and tired. Frank froze, body tight as wire. The beam passed again. This time it lingered for half a breath too long. Frank felt sweat rise behind his ears, cold as the wind outside. Then the beam moved on. The sound of footsteps faded. Now. Frank pulled the grate free and slid it silently inside the passage. His heart didn't race. It sank, heavy, certain, ready. He grabbed the edge of the hole, lifted himself slowly, and eased his shoulders through. The concrete scraped his coat. Dust filled his mouth. Pipes pressed cold metal against his back. He vanished into the wall. The night swallowed him, and Alcatraz kept breathing. The wall closed around Frank like he'd stepped into the ribcage of a sleeping beast. The ventilation passage was so narrow his shoulders brushed both sides as he crawled. Dust coated the floor in a thick layer, disturbed only by the slow drag of his elbows and the low hum of the pipes running beside him. Every vibration, every groan of old metal felt amplified in the tight space, echoing through his bones. He paused, letting his eyes adjust to the deeper darkness. The storm outside pressed into the concrete, sending faint tremors through the walls. The air in the passage was warm but stale, thick with the smell of rust and old water. He listened carefully. Distant footsteps on the tier, a guard's radio crackling somewhere above, and, most important of all, the coded taps from John and Clarence behind him. Frank counted the taps. 3 soft, 2 paused, 1 soft again. "I'm through," John's signal meant. Clarence answered a second later. right behind. Frank crawled forward, hands sliding over gritty cement. Occasionally his palm struck a drop of cold condensation dripping from overhead pipes. The water was shockingly cold, a reminder of the bay not far beneath them. It felt like the ocean could seep through the walls at any moment and flood the entire island out of spite. He reached the first junction, a cramped cross-section where the air shifted slightly. The space widened just enough for him to sit upright. Here the pipes hummed louder, carrying the sounds of flushing toilets and dripping sinks, Alcatraz's mechanical heartbeat. It was strange comfort. The familiar noise told him the schedule upstairs remained unchanged. A faint scuffle behind him signalled John entering the junction. Frank dimmed the headlamp with his palm. Light travelled dangerously far in these metal spaces. John's face appeared, smeared with dust, eyes wide but focused. He eased himself into the hollow with a quiet exhale. Moments later, Clarence crawled in behind him, wiping sweat and grime from his brow. "Tighter than usual," John whispered. "The storm's pushing air the wrong direction," Frank muttered. "It'll settle." Clarence sat with his back against a pipe, listening to the muffled wind. "Guards pacing heavy tonight. They get nervous when fog rolls in," Frank said. "Can't blame them." He reached for the small burlap bundle hidden in the hollow, a stash they'd built up over months. Inside were the raincoat sheets, folded and sealed into squares. The material crackled softly. These pieces, stitched together with stolen time and stolen heat, would become their raft. If it failed, the bay would finish the job the prison started. Below them, the faint rumble of waves striking rock drifted through the foundation. The sound was low, steady, almost patient. Frank had learned to respect that sound. The bay wasn't just cold, it was a living force that pulled, twisted, and killed without hesitation. Every second in that water would matter. He unfolded one sheet quietly, checking the seams. The brothers watched in silence, each man aware of how fragile their plan truly was. Every part had to hold. Every step had to align with the guard's rhythm. They had rehearsed the route, counted the minutes, tested the grates, mapped the rooftop. But the ocean was the one thing no man could predict. Frank crawled to the far end of the hollow where the vertical shaft rose toward the roof. The grate covering it had been loosened over weeks of silent work. He pressed his fingers to the metal and felt it shift slightly. Perfect. Behind him, Clarence whispered, "You sure this is the night?" Frank nodded. "Storm gives us cover. Fog hides the roof. Boats won't see a thing." John wiped dust from his face, breathing hard. "Roof will be slick." "Better slick than spotted," Frank replied. The wind outside pushed harder against the structure. The entire passage vibrated faintly, like the island shivering under the storm's weight. For a moment, everything fell eerily quiet. Even the toilets stopped their rumbling. It was the kind of pause that made Frank's instinct sharpen. made him listen for anything. Footsteps, radios, voices. But the silence passed. Routine returned. The guard's pace fell back into its predictable rhythm. Frank motioned for the brothers to gather. They crawled toward him until all three crouched beneath the vent shaft. He touched the grate again, then lifted it slowly. Compared to the cramped passage, the air felt sharp and clean, carrying the salty sting of the bay. "Time," Frank whispered. John nodded. Clarence nodded. Frank set the grate aside, pulled himself upward, and reached into the darkness above. He found the foothold he'd carved earlier. With a slow, controlled motion, he hauled himself into the shaft. Below him, the brothers waited. Above him, the roof waited. Beyond that, the bay. And Alcatraz, for the first time in years, felt like it was holding still, watching, letting them try. Frank climbed the shaft with slow, controlled movements, pressing his boots against the narrow walls as he rose toward the vent cover. The air grew colder with each foot upward, carrying the sting of the storm that scraped across the roof above. Halfway up, he paused and listened. A guard's boots clicked along the tier 2 floors above, the rhythm bending strangely through the pipes. 5 steps, shift, 5 more. Predictable. Good. He continued until his palms reached the vent cover. The screws loosened over weeks of careful work, shifted easily beneath his touch. Fog pressed through the tiny gaps around the metal, cold enough to sting his fingers. Frank waited through another sweep of the guard's light, counted the seconds until it moved on, then lifted the vent quietly and slid it aside. Cold air crashed down the shaft like a wave. He climbed onto the roof, the wind immediately forcing his coat tight against his ribs. The fog was so heavy, he could barely see 10 feet. The guard tower's lantern was only a blurred glow in the mist. The surface of the roof was slick, shining faintly in the dim light like wet glass. He crouched low, letting the fog swallow him. Below, John's whisper rose up the shaft. "Go on?" Frank leaned down. "Come." John climbed fast, his breath loud in the shaft. Frank helped him through the opening. John's face, pale in the fog, looked carved from frost. Clarence followed, slower but steady. The 3 men crouched together, letting the cold sink into them until their bodies matched the stillness of the night. Frank pointed to the far end of the roof. Low and quiet. They crawled, sliding their palms across the slick concrete. The fog curled around them like smoke, drifting in slow sheets. Every movement felt loud even when it made no sound. Frank's fingers brushed small puddles forming in dips along the roof, icy water soaking into his sleeves. The wind carried the distant churn of the bay, low, heavy, relentless. When they reached the roof's edge, Frank pressed flat and looked over. The drainage pipe was still there, the long, vertical metal spine they'd tested weeks earlier. Fog clung to it, turning its surface slick. The drop beneath it was long but manageable. Frank grabbed the pipe, felt its cold bite into his palms, and began lowering himself. Boots scraped softly against the wall, searching for footholds. He froze halfway down when a lantern flickered across the yard. The light drifted, wavered, then disappeared into fog. He continued until his boots hit the ground. He signaled the brothers with 2 sharp gestures. John descended next, careful but quick. Clarence followed, teeth clenched, moving with steady precision despite the cold biting into his hands. When all 3 stood in the narrow service alley, the fog pooled so thick it looked like they were standing inside a cloud. This alley ran behind the cell house, dark, cramped, shielded from the tower's direct view. Rusted pipes lined the wall. Boxes of old equipment cast long, distorted shadows that drifted with every shift of wind. Frank pressed a finger to his lips, then led them forward along the wall, bodies nearly brushing the concrete. A loose pipe rattled when Clarence's shoulder bumped it. All 3 froze instantly. Frank held his breath and listened. No footsteps, no voices, only the steady groan of the storm leaning against the building. They moved again. At the end of the alley, the fence rose above them, tall, sharp-edged, glistening with moisture. Beyond it lay the slope leading toward the shoreline, where their fragile raft waited in its hidden stash. The fog thickened near the fence, rolling like a low tide. Frank knelt and brushed his fingers along the wire. The metal was slick and cold, but solid. He reached into his coat and pulled out the bent metal clip he'd shaped months ago. Small, simple, but strong enough to pry open a gap. John crouched beside him, breath fogging the air. "We good?" "We're moving," Frank whispered. He slid the clip into the fence's seam. The wire shifted with a soft metallic sigh. And Alcatraz, its lights dim in the fog, its walls sweating from the storm, seemed to hold still, listening, as if it knew the island was about to lose something it never intended to release. Frank pulled the fence outward, just enough for a man to slide beneath it. The metal groaned softly, but the storm swallowed the sound. John dropped first, pressing flat against the wet ground as he slid under. Clarence followed, shoulders scraping the wire. Frank came last, pulling himself through the narrow gap until the metal brushed his back and released him into darkness. On the far side, the ground sloped steeply toward the island's edge. Fog poured down the incline like spilled milk, curling around their legs. Frank crouched low and pointed toward the distant rocks, where the cliff dipped toward the shoreline. Waves slammed the island in slow, crushing bursts, each impact sending vibrations through the earth. They moved carefully, using the slope's exposed rocks for balance. Their hands brushed damp soil and slick patches of moss. The wind pushed at their backs, turning the fog into shifting walls. Every few steps, Frank stopped and listened. The storm warped sound, sometimes hiding it, sometimes delivering it too clearly. Distant metal clanged. A shout travelled across the yard, then vanished. Halfway down, John froze and signaled with a raised hand. Voices drifted through the fog. 2 guards patrolling near the western wall. Their lanterns swung, throwing a faint, shaky glow through the mist. Frank pressed himself against the ground, the damp sinking into his coat. Clarence lay beside him, breath shallow. Storm's getting worse. Nothing moves on nights like this. Frank didn't breathe. The lantern beam wandered, flickered, then disappeared into the fog. The voices faded. Frank tapped the earth twice. Move. They continued down the slope toward the small rock shelf that overlooked the bay. The stash lay hidden beneath a cluster of stones wedged against the cliff wall. Frank knelt, brushed the rocks aside, and uncovered the bundle of raincoat panels. The fabric crackled softly in the cold. John and Clarence crouched beside him, checking seams, ties, and patches with quick, experienced hands. The wind gusted hard, spraying fine salt water across their faces. The bay's breath seeped into every movement, every breath, every inch of skin it touched. Frank listened to the ocean, deep, heavy, steady. Even from here, the water sounded colder than anything inside the prison. A reminder, the bay was the real warden. He turned toward the dark horizon, though the fog showed him nothing. No city lights, no shore, only a blank wall of white. They had memorized the tide charts. Tonight, the current would push them toward the northeast pocket of the bay, where debris often washed ashore. It was the closest thing they had to a path. Clarence lifted the bundle under his arm, gripping it tight. Frank led them toward the edge of the island, where jagged rocks formed a natural staircase toward the sea. He lowered himself onto the first rock, boots skidding on algae. He steadied himself with one hand, fingers gripping the cold stone, until the shock passed. They climbed rock to rock, timing their movements with the tide. When a wave crashed high, they pressed into the cliff's shadow and waited for the water to recoil. Twice the ocean lunged unexpectedly, spraying their legs with freezing water. The cold gnawed instantly through fabric. At the lowest shelf, they stopped. This was the narrow ledge where the raft would be assembled and launched. Fog had pooled here in a thick, ghostly layer. The guard tower's beam barely reached this far, only a faint glow pulsing behind the storm. Clarence unwrapped the bundle, revealing the folded raft sections. The raincoat material glistened faintly in the mist. Frank knelt and unfolded the raft, methodically. Numb hands working quickly despite the cold. John braced the edges, shielding it from the wind. The tide surged again, slamming the rock with a heavy thud. Frank steadied the raft and listened for footsteps above. Nothing, only the storm. "This is our window," he whispered. John nodded, jaw clenched. Clarence tightened the final seam, breath fogging the air. Frank lifted the raft. It felt too light, too fragile. But it was all they had. Another wave struck, spraying their boots. "We launch now," Frank said quietly. He looked at the black water below. Cold enough to stop a man's heart in minutes, shifting with currents stronger than any swimmer. Fog drifted across its surface, turning the bay into a blank, living void. Frank exhaled once, steady and long. "One," he whispered. Frank steadied the raft as another wave slammed the rock shelf. The fog pressed down harder now, thick enough to blur the line between air and sea. The raft looked impossibly fragile against the dark, shifting water. Thin layers of stitched raincoat rubber standing in defiance of a tide that had swallowed far stronger things. John crouched beside him, gripping one of the side seams. "It'll hold," he whispered. The uncertainty in his eyes betrayed him. Clarence said nothing. He was staring at the water with a look that hovered between fear and focus, jaw clenched tight. The waves took breath after breath, curling inward, slamming the rock, then pulling back with a deep, gurgling hiss. Frank studied the rhythm, counting the seconds between the highest swells. Timing mattered. Every movement tonight was a negotiation with forces larger than them. Wind, water, fog, the cold itself. "On the next pull," Frank said. "When it drops, we go." The ocean bulged upward, then collapsed in a heavy crash that shook the stones beneath their feet. Frank gripped the raft with both hands. Clarence and John mirrored him, crouched low, bodies braced. The retreat came a moment later, slower, like the bay was inhaling. "Now," Frank breathed. The three men stepped off the rock, lowering the raft into the water in one smooth motion. The cold hit immediately, an icy slap that seeped through their sleeves as they steadied the raft. Frank stepped in first, sinking into the fragile craft as it bowed under his weight. John climbed in next, then Clarence, who held the last rope between his teeth while he folded himself inside. The raft swayed violently at first, wobbling under the push of the tide. Frank's hands tightened on the sides. The rubber felt too soft, too warm compared to the freezing bay, but it floated. For now, it floated. They pushed away from the rocks. The island loomed behind them, a dark, jagged shadow rising from the fog. Alcatraz never looked more like a beast than from the water. The cell house lights flickered faintly on the cliff, muted by mist. Each faint spark, a reminder of what they had just crawled out of. Frank kept his voice low. "Paddles." John and Clarence pulled out the makeshift paddles, flat pieces of wood shaped in the workshop. They pressed them into the water slowly, careful not to splash. Every sound mattered. The fog magnified whispers and hid footsteps, but a sudden crack of wood on water could travel far in the stillness of the night. The first pull of the current took them by surprise. It gripped the raft from underneath, turning the bow toward the open bay. Frank dug his paddle in to correct the angle, jaw tight against the cold. His fingers were already numb. The water bit through his sleeves like teeth. "Keep low," he said. "Stay with the current, not against it." John nodded, breath shaking. Clarence paddled without speaking, his shoulders trembling from cold and nerves. The fog swallowed nearly everything. The island blurred behind them until it seemed to dissolve into the mist. Only the guard tower lights still blinked, a faint, ghostly pulse swallowed by distance. The tide pushed them farther out. Frank watched the water carefully. The surface shifted in dark, heavy swells. Some were smooth. Others hid undercurrents that could flip the raft with one wrong angle. The bay wasn't violent tonight. It was patient, and patience was more dangerous. Cold crept into his bones. His toes went numb inside his shoes. His fingers stiffened around the paddle. But he forced his movements to stay steady, controlled, rhythmic. Panic on the water was noise. Noise meant discovery. They drifted past the first invisible boundary, the point where the floodlights could no longer pierce the fog. Clarence whispered, "We're clear of sight lines." "Not of sound," Frank muttered. They paddled in silence for several long minutes. The ocean hissed against the raft's thin sides, and mist drifted so thick over the water it felt like they were floating through clouds. The only points of reference were the faint clunks of waves against distant rocks and the low hum of the wind. At one point, a distant motor rumbled through the fog, a patrol boat. Frank froze mid-stroke. John did too. Clarence held his breath. The motor grew louder, then softer, then vanished entirely into the storm. The fog saved them. Tonight, it was the only ally they had. Frank motioned for them to keep paddling. Slow, slow as breathing. They drifted deeper into the bay until Alcatraz disappeared entirely behind the fog. The island was gone, swallowed. Just another shadow erased by the night. Frank looked out across the water. No lights, no shore, no sense of direction except the pull of the tide beneath them. The raft creaked softly. Waves nudged it with quiet insistence. The bay held them now. Not as prisoners, not as free men, but as strangers crossing a world that didn't care whether they lived or vanished. The raft drifted deeper into the bay, carried by a slow but insistent current. Frank felt the shift beneath them. Small tremors, gentle rises, then the hollow dip of the tide breathing under the raincoat rubber. The fog thickened again, wrapping around the raft in cold, damp layers that blurred the line between air and water. The wind pushed pockets of mist across the surface like drifting sheets. Frank paddled in short, controlled strokes. His fingers were stiff now, almost wooden. The cold numbed them from the outside in, each movement sending a delayed shock through his arms. John's breath shook with every exhale, teeth clicking softly. Clarence paddled with his shoulders hunched, the cold digging into him in waves. A sudden swell lifted the raft a few inches, enough to tilt them. Frank steadied the angle with a quick shift of weight. "Flow with it," he whispered, "not against." Another swell rose, this one taller. The raft climbed and dropped with a slap against the surface. Water splashed over the edge, hitting Frank's knee with a shock sharp enough to steal his breath. Clarence held his paddle tighter, knuckles pale. Fog briefly parted, revealing faint city lights far away. Glittering spots blurred into smears by the storm. The sight gave Frank direction, if not comfort. Those lights could be blocks or miles away. In fog, this thick distance meant nothing. Another wave hit, harder. The raft wobbled. John instinctively leaned the wrong way. "Other side," Frank hissed. John corrected, swallowing a breath. The raft steadied, rocking only slightly. They held still, letting the raft settle in the tide's rhythm. Frank could hear their hearts more than their voices, the shaky breaths, the small grunts of cold, the shifting weight as muscles tired. "Slow breaths," Frank said quietly. "Don't let the cold lock your chest." Clarence let out a visible puff of air. "Didn't think it'd hit this fast." "That's the bay," Frank murmured. "It crawls in." John's hands trembled. "Feels like it's crawled all the way up." Frank didn't answer. He kept his stroke steady, watching the water for patterns. The swells came in threes, two small, one steep. When the big one lifted them next, he braced, letting the raft ride the incline instead of cutting against it. The drop that followed rattled the seams but held. A deep horn echoed through the fog moments later, long, low, vibrating across the surface of the water. A ship, far away but large enough that its presence felt physical. The sound rolled over them like a warning from something massive and unseen. "Cargo ship," Clarence whispered. "Too distant," Frank said, though the tension in his voice betrayed uncertainty. They drifted in silence. Fog absorbed everything except the cold. The water around them shifted again, the subtle pull telling Frank the ship's wake was coming. A moment later, it arrived. A sharper swell, rising fast, lifting the raft higher than any before. "Brace," Frank whispered. The raft climbed the swell. For a brief moment, the bow felt weightless, suspended. Then it dropped with a thud that echoed in their bones. Water splashed hard over the front seam, soaking John's sleeves and washing over Frank's hands. John choked on a breath but kept his paddle steady. When the wake faded, only the tide remained. Fog peeled back for a moment, revealing a faint outline ahead. Something tall, skeletal, like a shadow rising above the bay. The shape lasted only seconds before fog swallowed it again, but Frank recognized it anyway. The faint silhouette of the Golden Gate's lower span. "North-northeast," he murmured. "Stay angled with the pull." Clarence adjusted his strokes. John tried, though his arms trembled with exhaustion. Frank dipped his hand into the water briefly. The cold was brutal, beyond what skin should tolerate. The bay didn't try to kill quickly. It drained heat minute by minute, patient and methodical. They pushed forward through long, slow drifts. The fog thickened again until there was no sign of the island behind them. No lights, no tower glow, no hum of machinery. Alcatraz was gone, erased by the night as if it had never been there. John shivered violently. Clarence's breaths came shorter. Frank kept his paddle moving, each stroke slower, more deliberate. The raft wasn't just carrying them. It was carrying the weight of time, cold, exhaustion, and the quiet question none of them spoke aloud. How much longer could their bodies last? The bay didn't need to fight them. It only needed to wait. The bay shifted beneath them so suddenly that Frank felt the change before he saw it. One moment, the current pulled in a steady line. The next, it twisted sideways, dragging the raft at an angle that made him snap to alert. He dipped his paddle, adjusting the raft's direction with a careful, practiced motion. Clarence mirrored him, but John's stroke faltered midway, the paddle trembling between numb fingers. "Angle with it," Frank whispered. "Don't fight the drift." John tried. His hands shook uncontrollably. The cold wasn't just on the surface anymore. It was working inward, settling behind the ribs, making every breath feel slow and weak. Fog pressed low around them, tightening like a damp shroud. The raft rocked again, another swell rising under one side. Frank braced his legs, absorbing the tilt. Clarence steadied himself, panting lightly. Fog peeled sideways as the wind shifted, revealing a darker band of swirling water ahead. Frank recognized it. "Tide loop," he said quietly. "We keep left." He and Clarence dug their paddles in, trying to redirect the raft's nose. The movement worked for a moment, until something solid slammed into the underside of the raft. A deep, muffled thud. The raft lurched. Water sloshed over the edge. John slipped, grabbing the side seam. "What was that?" he gasped. "Debris," Frank said, though he wasn't sure. Something scraped underneath them again, sliding away like a submerged beam or plank drifting with the current. "Keep moving," Frank whispered. "Cold winds if you stop." They paddled again, slower but determined. Fog closed in, and the faint city lights appeared as blurry smudges, just enough to show direction, but not distance. The cold numbed Frank's hands so completely he could barely feel the paddle. Clarence's breaths came shorter, visible wisps drifting sideways. John's movements were slow, weak. Another cross-current hit, lifting the raft sharply. The bow angled too high before dropping fast. Water splashed inside, freezing their legs instantly. Clarence gritted his teeth. John let out a soft gasp. "Bail," Frank said. They scooped water out with their hands, throwing it back into the bay. The raft sagged for a moment, then steadied. Fog shifted again, revealing nothing but the same endless sheet of grey water. Then came a sound, deep and distant. A ship horn. The sound rolled through the fog so slowly it felt like the voice of something huge and unseen. Frank stiffened. "Wake's coming," he murmured. The first hint of it arrived as a subtle, upward lift beneath the raft, then a stronger swell rising behind it. Frank grabbed the raft's side. "Brace!" The swell lifted them quickly, pushing the nose upward. For a moment, the raft felt weightless, balanced on a moving slope of water. Then it dropped. Hard. Water splashed over the side, hitting all three in the chest. John nearly lost his paddle. Clarence grabbed his sleeve to keep him from tipping. When the wake passed, the raft drifted forward shakily, its seams groaning. Fog thinned briefly, revealing a faint shadow ahead, something tall and angular, a fragment of the Golden Gate Bridge's lower span, faint as a memory. Frank took it in quickly. North-northeast. Stay angled. Clarence paddled. John tried, but his arms shook too violently. When he dipped his paddle again, it slipped from his grip and splashed into the water. John instinctively leaned after it. "Don't!" Frank snapped. Clarence grabbed John's collar and yanked him back. The paddle drifted away and vanished into fog. John shook. "I didn't mean to." Frank shoved a spare half paddle toward him. "Use this. We keep going." John clutched it with numb hands, but his strokes were weak. The current changed again, pushing them faster. Frank felt the pull. Long, slow ropes under the water, dragging them in a direction he didn't like. A riptide. He dug his paddle deeper, angling hard. Clarence matched him. The raft tilted slightly, then straightened. John tried to help, but had little strength left. Fog drifted aside once more, revealing a faint smear of warm light. Land. Not close, not guaranteed, but real. "We're getting there," Clarence breathed. Frank didn't answer. They were closer, yes, but the cold was working faster than the distance. John's head drooped. Clarence's arms shook. Frank felt the cold crawling deeper into his chest. The bay wasn't trying to drown them all at once. It was choosing who to take first. The fog shifted again, peeling away just long enough for Frank to see a dark, uneven smear ahead. Land. Not close, not certain, but unmistakably solid. Clarence saw it too, leaning forward as if his eyes could pull it nearer. "There," he whispered, voice thin and tight. John lifted his head at the sound, but his eyes were unfocused, the pupils slow to respond. His breaths came fast and shallow, each one trembling out of him like the air itself was freezing before it left his lungs. Frank leaned close, steadying John's hands on the paddle. "You stay awake. Small strokes. Anything. Just move." John nodded, though weakly. He paddled in slow half motions that barely skimmed the surface. Clarence adjusted his rhythm to compensate. Frank paddled harder, working against the current's subtle push to keep their direction aligned with the faint outline of shoreline. The water tightened beneath them, the current shifting again, thicker and more stubborn. Clarence's paddle hit something underwater, a dull, heavy knock. "That's not driftwood," he muttered. "Doesn't matter," Frank said. "We push through it." Fog crowded low around them, shrinking their world to a single, dim circle. The shoreline vanished again behind the moving mist. Only the wind, the tide, and the tremble in John's arms reminded Frank how little time they had. The bay could take a man quietly, with no splash or struggle, just cold creeping into the chest until nothing moved. A sideways swell slapped into them, jerking the raft. Clarence steadied John quickly. The half paddle nearly slipped from John's fingers. Frank caught the motion and tightened his grip on the raft's edge. "Keep him upright," he whispered. Clarence nodded, shifting his body closer. The fog peeled back once more, and this time the land appeared clearer. Dark ridges, jagged rocks, long vertical lines where seaweed clung to the stone. The shape of a narrow inlet cut between the rocks. Not a beach, a precarious landing. Frank studied the angle of the tide. "Cut left, follow the pull." They angled the raft carefully. John shivered violently but tried to match them. Frank guided John's paddle, moving their hands together in slow, precise arcs. The shoreline grew bigger, too fast. The tide was pulling them harder than before. The raft rolled up a swell and then dipped sharply. A submerged rock slammed into the underside, jarring all three of them. John slipped sideways again, and Clarence grabbed him by the coat. "We're hitting bottom," Clarence said. "Not yet," Frank replied. "Hold steady." Another impact, harder, sharp enough to bow the raft floor inward. Frank felt the rubber flex under his knees. They were in shallow water now, the most dangerous zone of all. Rocks beneath, tide above, no room to maneuver. Fog lifted again in a quick gust, revealing the rocks in full. Black teeth rising from the water, small channels of calmer water between them, a narrow path forward, only a few feet wide. "That gap," Frank said. "Aim straight through." Clarence turned the raft. John tried to help, but his arms barely responded. Frank reached across, covering John's hands with his own, guiding the paddle through water thick with cold and grit. The current shoved them at an angle. Clarence gritted his teeth, digging in hard. Frank matched him stroke for stroke. The raft shifted just enough. They slid into the narrow gap. A swell from behind rose high and caught them perfectly, pushing the raft through the rock channel. The bow scraped the side of a submerged stone, but the tide carried them past it, into a pocket of calmer water. The bottom brushed something soft, sand or tightly packed silt. "Shallow," Clarence said, hope breaking through the cold. Another swell nudged them forward. The raft struck ground gently, then settled. Frank stabbed his paddle into the sand, anchoring them. "Out! Quick!" Clarence climbed out first and staggered, nearly collapsing when his legs hit the frigid shallows. He grabbed the raft's edge and braced it for Frank. Frank turned to John. "You're coming out with us," he said. John didn't move. His head drooped. His lips were nearly grey. "I can't feel anything," he whispered. Frank hooked his arms under John's and pulled. "You don't need to feel. You just need to move." John slid forward, feet dragging in the water. Clarence reached for him, pulling him onto the sand. Behind them, the bay surged again, a wave rising high enough to slap the raft's stern, salt water spilling across the sand. Land was under their feet, but the bay was still reaching for them, deciding whether to let them stay. The sand under Frank's boots felt unreal, too solid after so many hours of shifting water beneath them. He stumbled as he pulled John farther onto shore, his numb legs barely responding. Clarence clung to John's other arm, breath rattling out of him in hard bursts. It felt like they had slipped not onto land, but into another quiet pocket of the bay. John's knees buckled as soon as they reached firm ground. He collapsed onto the wet sand, body shaking violently. Frank dropped beside him, supporting his weight. Clarence crouched on the other side, rubbing his hands together to bring back circulation. "John," Frank whispered, "you need to keep your eyes open." John blinked slowly, eyelids heavy as stones. "Feels warm," he murmured. Frank's breath tightened. Warm wasn't good. Warm meant the cold was too deep, too advanced. "Stay with us," he said. "Just breathe. Slow. You made it this far." Another wave rolled up the shoreline, brushing their ankles. The cold shot up Frank's legs like a warning. He pulled John farther inland, away from the water's reach. Clarence followed, dragging himself through the sand with shaking arms. There were no landmarks, no lights, no sounds of distant cars, nothing to tell them where they were. Only the slow crash of the bay behind them and the occasional rattle of pebbles rolling under retreating waves. Clarence looked around, brow furrowed. "Are we on the right side?" His voice trembled, not from fear, but from the cold digging into his chest. Frank scanned the fog. He could barely see his own hands. "We're somewhere north," he said, though the certainty in his voice was thinner than he wanted. John coughed weakly. It was barely a sound, more a breath that caught and fizzled out. Frank leaned over him, checking his face. John's skin was pale beneath the sand, his lips tinged with blue. Clarence wiped his nose with a shaking hand. "We need to move inland. Find cover. Anything." Frank nodded. Staying still was death. They had to stand, walk, keep blood moving. He grabbed John's arm and hauled him upright, though John's legs barely responded. Clarence supported the other side, and together they staggered forward into the fog, away from the bay's reach. John stumbled again, nearly dragging both men down with him. Clarence caught him by the shoulders. "Come on, keep your feet under you." "Trying," John whispered. Frank could feel the cold invading his own muscles. His fingers were nearly useless, but he forced his legs forward, focused on the simple motion: step, drag, brace. The fog thinned for a moment, revealing a faint silhouette, something tall and rectangular, a structure, a shed, a rock formation. It vanished just as quickly, swallowed again by the moving curtain of mist. Frank blinked hard, trying to pinpoint direction. "This way," he said, though he wasn't certain. Clarence didn't argue. There wasn't time for doubt. The three men pushed forward, step by step, dragging John's weight between them. The wind shifted, bringing a sharper sting of salt water. The bay was close. Too close. They needed distance. John sagged again. This time he dropped to one knee. Clarence and Frank lowered with him, careful not to let him fall face first into the dirt. "John," Frank whispered, "stay awake." John's eyes moved sluggishly. "Can't see anything." "You don't have to see. Just breathe with us." Frank pressed a hand against John's back, feeling the faint tremors beneath the soaked fabric. Clarence reached out and steadied John's shoulder. The fog wrapped around them tightly again, blurring their edges, softening the world until the three men were nothing but shapes huddled against the cold. A faint sound broke the silence, distant, muffled, impossible to place. It could have been a car, a horn, or the wind shifting through trees. The fog warped everything. Frank listened closely, head tilted. "We're near something. Keep moving." Clarence nodded. Together they rose again, pulling John between them. They took one step, then another. The ground sloped slightly upward. They walked until Frank couldn't feel the difference between the shaking in his legs and the trembling earth beneath them. John's breaths grew shallower. Clarence's voice wavered each time he whispered encouragement. The fog swallowed them deeper as they staggered inland. Somewhere behind them, the bay washed against the rocks, a slow rhythmic beat, like a heart too big for the world. It didn't roar now, it didn't chase them. It simply waited. Frank tightened his grip on John, forcing his own body to keep going. They kept moving into the grey, three silhouettes in the fog, cold gnawing at their limbs, land beneath their feet, but no guarantee of survival. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible through the storm-thick night, the possibility of help, or nothing at all. The bay would decide. History would fill in what it could. But the truth of that final stretch disappeared into the fog with them.